Welcome to Bloomberg Sightlines, our look into the challenges and opportunities facing companies in a world where borders are becoming less and less relevant each day. I'm your host, Michael Bancroft. Over the next hour, we'll explore what it takes to compete on a global scale and what Canadian companies and governments can do to give themselves an edge over larger rivals. On that note, let's hear from the industry insiders themselves, 4 Canadian executives that have established themselves on the world stage in the first of our 3-part conversation. So I wanted to bring together business leaders that have an array of experience from different industries and really take a look at this idea of doing business in a borderless economy. And I wanted to start off with taking a look at competition. And maybe the best place to start is, where does Canada fit in the marketplace on a global perspective, Don?
I think it depends what industry you're in. I'm in the automotive industry, and it is a truly global business. And I may be biased, but I think it's the highest tech business in the world because it has more software and it's very high volume. It's a multi-trillion dollar industry. It's already completely global. It depends where you develop your technology. Canada's got very bright people, very good universities. And there's various places that are better in the world to manufacture and engineer and tool. But Canada's got a lot of capability here. And then you just got to be careful what you do when you go global.
Are there any missteps that people do when they are performing or doing business on a global scale?
I mean, I really think that one of the biggest missteps is not having an appreciation for what's going on in the local market you're entering, and not bringing talent from the local market, particularly from a business development perspective. You see that, and I'm in the telecommunications industry, and wireless operators often that are global make the mistake of actually entering a market and bringing all their own team from the mothership, putting them down into that new market, and thinking that consumers are going to buy products the same way they did in their home market, and think that all the systems that are working great in the home market are going to suddenly transfer seamlessly to the new market, and that's just often not the case.
I would agree. I mean, I'm in financial services, but certainly have looked at multiple countries around the world, and often a key mistake we see is you take a leader from one market, bring her or him to another market, try and launch the same things to those consumers, and actually it seldom works. So finding the blend between using your knowledge that you have in Canada or whatever it is, but really blending with the needs of the country that you're in, and getting leaders in that country as well.
Do you actually think, though, that Canada can get there and really be a leader and compete on a global scale?
Yeah, I think absolutely, as Don said, like the talent is here, the capacity is here, the will is here. But I think sometimes maybe some of the practice isn't here. Like, I do worry that sometimes a lot of what Canada's business has been built on is a lot of what I guess you could call, for lack of a better word, branch plant organizations. Like, we don't tend to have the head offices here of very large companies. And that can, I think, stymie any kind of development of skill sets that you might need to really go global, because you don't really have decision making here in those situations. Ultimately, I don't know that there's enough here to keep people engaged in a level, and I think that's why a lot of Canadians leave. That's why I left.
But you've come back now, so how are you going to implement what you've learned, all that experience in the US, to help fix that? Because I mean, how do people do that? How do we bring these head offices into Canada or have them here? I mean, there's only a handful, really.
Yeah, I think it's a matter of what is an interesting space to me right now is that kind of level of entrepreneurship in tech. Like, to your point, tech is everywhere now. It's not just in a tech company, and we have a lot of great minds
We've
that way.
gotten great at starting up companies.
Yeah, absolutely. And so it's like, I
companies.
think you've also talked a lot about this too, around the challenges of how do you grow them up to a space where they can then go global.
Right. Yeah, we end up losing them at 50 or 100 employees or 20 or 30 million in revenue. We lose them to other markets, and then they end up scaling in the US or further abroad. We need to figure out how to get them to scale here. That's going to have the most meaningful impact, I think, long term.
So is it immigration? Is it education? So, I mean, how do you keep them here? Because, I mean, you see a lot of people that become skilled and they're lured outside of Canada, as you were. Mm-hmm. So what's that answer for employers?
Part of it's industry, part of it's having the head office here, because if you do have the head office here, our head office here, we have about 21,000 people out of 150, but we make the decisions. I think part of it is the government has a role to play too. If the government believes that you should keep on taxing the really wealthy people and surcharges and taxing companies, especially looking at things like capital gains and options. That will drive the wealthy people out of the country. And as soon as you do that, it may sound like you're gaining something by really taxing them, but you've taken the brain power down the country. Once the brain power is gone at the top, they're going to make decisions based on where they're located.
Yeah, I agree with that point, and maybe another thing government can do too. And I know our former prime minister was in Israel. I had the opportunity with some people we partner with in Israel and other countries to see how government really embraces entrepreneurialism. Mm-hmm. They invest in companies, they incubate companies, they take ownership positions in companies, and their country's small, so everything is global oriented. And the government wins too because they get a stake when these companies are sold. So that's maybe yet another way to really facilitate innovation in this country.
I think if you look at some of the countries like China, Korea, and Israel for sure, I think that a country needs to have, I would call it an industrial policy, but maybe it's a technology policy, whatever. But if you don't want to pick industries, but you want to make it conducive to really eliminate roadblocks, eliminate costs, don't burden companies because they will move. We're in a global economy. They'll move to the place where you can make the most amount of money.
And that's a point to make too. It's like it's not just technology companies we're talking about and doing startups in the technology space. We're talking about all industries to try and attract and keep the talent here and grow Canada and make it a global competitor, right?
Yeah, and what a great time we have right now. Like Canada is there on the map. Like we have had a rejuvenation of our PR, if you want to call it that. Like it's everything from pop culture. Like we've got Drake, we've got The Weeknd. Like we represent things on a global scale that are influencing a lot of people internationally, and they come from Canada, and it's cool.
And the U.S. has gone a different direction.
Yeah.
So we have probably our best moment of all time with the way the U.S.
Yeah, we have an opportunity now. I think I'm sure we all got a lot of telephone calls the days after the election, and some really interesting people, both Canadians who want to come back and Americans who are looking for a different place to live because they're not too happy with the changes politically down there. Like we do have an opportunity right now to kind of seize that moment.
So I am interested, how important or crucial is it when you are doing business to be doing business in places that have, say, free trade deals?
Certainly from the Canadian perspective, I mean, it's a significant part of our economy. 20% of our entire GDP is exports to the U.S. alone. So I mean, I think that it's critically important for Canada. But thinking borderless economies more generally, I'm on the perspective that we should have fewer and fewer trade barriers. Speaking of Canada specifically, though, like domestically, we have a huge problem, as we all know at this table, interprovincially. Yeah. We don't trade with ourselves well at all, and I think that's really hurting our prosperity.
Yeah, I think it's a no-brainer to eliminate things interprovincially. If we're going to do trade deals, we should do intelligent trade deals. I would say North America, being both Canada and the U.S., just say it's very popular to say let's have free trade. Quite often is not good for the country. I think NAFTA, we have to have it, and we should have open trade with Mexico. We need a low-cost spot where we can make things and put them into bigger modules and bigger products. But free trade around the world, just for the sake of saying we've signed a deal, is not always very intelligent.
The scrutiny on trade deals is only going to intensify once Donald Trump takes over the White House. He's threatened to tear up the North American Free Trade Agreement and pull out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Both moves could have serious repercussions for Canadian companies doing business around the world. Coming up, we'll hear why greater gender diversity in the corporate boardroom could be one key to competitiveness in a borderless economy. The global economy may be opening up, but corporate boardrooms haven't followed suit. They're still predominantly filled with men. Research and advisory firm Catalyst is looking to change that dynamic. It aims to accelerate the inclusion of women at the upper levels of corporate management. Deborah Gillis is leading the charge, and she weighed in on where Canada fits into that movement.
I think particularly since Prime Minister Trudeau has declared gender diversity to be a priority for Canada, there's an expectation that Canada is doing so much better than many countries, when in fact there are many countries in the world that we lag behind in terms of the representation of women in leadership. Norway, France are examples of those countries. And so we've got a lot of work to do to continue to make progress for women in our workplaces.
Are there specific sectors that are doing better than others?
We often point to Canada's banks as some of the leaders, and I think it's interesting in that context that many of Canada's banks have made what I would call the journey from compliance to commitment as industries that have been required for many years to report to the federal government in terms of employment equity numbers. There's been a real shift where the leaders of those organizations have really seen the benefit to their business of having more diverse leadership, to the point where today we have the chair of the board of RBC is a woman for the first time. So that's an example of where we've seen progress happen because of intentional leadership.
But so what are some of the difficulties, though, facing companies being able to implement specific, initiatives within their company for gender diversity?
The key thing for business leaders is to be intentional in their actions. I often tell the story that when Prime Minister Trudeau attended the Catalyst Awards dinner in New York in March of 2016, he gave a really important message, which was, my gender balance cabinet didn't happen by accident. He talked about putting a program in place that he called Ask Her to Run, where he went and had multiple conversations with women, which built a pipeline of talent that were ready to serve in cabinet. In the same way, that kind of intentional action needs to happen on the part of business leaders, and we're seeing many good examples of that starting to take place. It's when there is intention to ensuring that women get the right opportunities, that they get P&L roles early on in their careers, that they get international assignments that position them for those leadership roles, that we'll see change happen.
Do you need specific compulsory targets to be able to move the needle and make real change?
It's interesting. We've seen really good examples around the world. So, for example, if you point to Australia or the UK, they're examples of two countries where the requirements have not been compulsory, meaning quotas haven't been put in place, but at the same time, the framework and government stepping forward and encouraging comply or explain models have really helped to accelerate the progress of women's appointment to boards and leadership positions. So quotas are not the only strategy that can be effective. Here in Canada, the OSC has taken a leadership role, again, put in a comply or explain model. I think it's disappointing that we haven't seen quite the progress that we'd like to see, but at the same time, there's a real shift in conversation that's happening not only in Canada but around the world. And I would describe that shift as a transition from business leaders asking, why should I pay attention to diversity and inclusion, to asking how. What do we need to do?
What specifically can companies do to ensure they have the right policies and really help bring women through the ranks and into senior leadership roles within their companies?
The visibility and the relationships for women become really critical. It's why Catalyst has a program that we call Women on Board that pairs individual women with sitting CEOs or senior board directors who serve as their mentors and sponsors. What that program shows us is that 53% of the women who have participated in that program have been appointed to corporate boards. This isn't a supply problem. It is often a relationship problem where I give it a slight twist on the old expression, it's not what you know, it's who you know. In fact, it's who knows what you know that really can matter. So that visibility and the active sponsorship is a critical part of what needs to happen.
So how do you strike the right balance, though, in being proactive and conscious of gender diversity within your workplace, but at the same time ensuring you get the best and right candidate for the job?
We need to refocus our efforts to say, let's create a level playing field where we're ensuring that everyone has a fair and equal opportunity to compete for those positions, so that leaders are actually looking at the full range of talent in the pool that they're drawing from. Some of what that requires is, as I said, mentors and sponsors who play a critical role. Some of it is ensuring that women have opportunity to the right mission critical skills and opportunities. It's interesting when we look at Catalyst data, what it tells us is that even when organizations are focusing on their high potential talent, men tend to get opportunities that position them for future advancement. For example, They are given mission critical roles with larger budgets, larger teams, more visibility to the leaders of their companies. So we need to ensure that the opportunities that will really position your career for the next step are being given to both men and women, and that requires intentional focus and action.
The role that you're in currently, what is the one thing that you very much personally would like to achieve in the next 6 to 12 months?
I'd like to see accelerated change. So the trajectory in terms of the appointment of women to senior positions, I'd like to see that start to move, to see year-over-year progress, and to really build on the momentum that I see where business leaders are saying, okay, what do we need to do? How do we move forward? How do we make progress? That kind of proactive intentionality, I think, is what's really going to shift the landscape and what I'd like to see more of in the coming year, and frankly, why I'm optimistic going into 2017, because that shift in tone and dialogue from why to how is fundamentally different than where it was when I came into my first role at Catalyst 10.5 years ago. That's a solid platform for, moving forward.
After the break, we'll speak with a woman who broke through the barriers facing female executives to rise to the top of the male-dominated oil and gas industry. Stay tuned. If you scan through the faces of board members in most Canadian energy companies, you'll notice a key similarity. They're mostly older white men. Geeta Sankappanavar is the complete opposite. The president of investment firm Grafton Asset Management has pulled in more than $1 billion in capital from global investors eager to invest in Calgary's oil and gas sector. She says Canada is heading in the wrong direction if it hopes to remain competitive among fierce competition.
A few years ago, I would have said Canada was incredibly competitive. We had stability of regulatory regime, we had stability of a fiscal regime, we had a great educated technical workforce, we had tax incentives, we had a government that was open to foreign direct investment, and the world knew it. Today, that's a little bit different. I think we've changed quite a bit of that. Canada trades like the emerging markets. People don't like to hear that. They always believe industries are based on fundamentals. But in reality, that is the truth. Canada trades on fund flows into and out of our country. The single biggest initiative for Canada today, globally, is to attract foreign direct investment. And in order to do that, you need to have stability of fiscal regime, stability of government. You need to have a strong market presence around the world. And then the last piece is you need to have projects that are economic, even at lower commodity prices, even being at the end of the pipe.
And so has it changed in the ability to attract those dollars given the instability of prices and what we've seen over the last few years?
The change in commodity prices has actually created a phenomenal investment opportunity for anybody in the oil and gas sector. But being in Canada, we've actually gone a little bit the other way. We've become uncompetitive compared to other countries in terms of attracting capital.
So where specifically are those opportunities that you're seeing here in Canada?
We've actually stayed away from buying producing assets in the marketplace. Instead, what we've done is we've gone to opportunities where below ground, our subsurface, we see great rock. But above ground, we see a lot of challenges. As private capital, where we can come in is where we don't have to be able to get an asset producing immediately tomorrow. Instead, we can take the 3 years or 5 years that it takes to solve all these problems and look for outsized returns. So last year, at the height of $28 oil, we bought about 100 sections of Montney land, and we've been quite happy with it.
Taking a look at, say, carbon emission targets and then that push of sustainable energy, has that changed the way you guys approach investments, and are you invested in that area?
We're not invested in that area today, but it is definitely a defensive positioning for our business that we are taking a look at very, very strongly.
Why not now?
Well, there's a lot of uncertainty in exactly how it's going to play out. And until that uncertainty is eliminated, it's difficult to invest in. Once you have the set of rules in the playbook, then you can create the opportunities that make the most sense economically. But you need that playbook first. In terms of how the carbon tax, et cetera, affects our business, it hurts it. That's pure and simple. It's just one more tax and one more cost that you have to add into the equation in order to figure out how you make money.
How has your business model changed given this rapid push towards this borderless economy? Because we've seen this jump in the last couple of years. Technology really has transcended all industries. So no matter where you are in the world, you're competing with everybody in the world.
I think it's about capital flows again. I think where it has changed is even 10 years ago, Calgary, when it needs capital, or the Canadian energy industry, when it needs capital, it went to a very known set of capital providers. They followed the very well-trodden path of resource hedge funds, resource pension funds in the New York, Toronto, Chicago, like the usual suspects. And a few of our brave companies went across the pond to London and raised capital there. I think in the last 5 to 10 years, what we've seen is with the opening of borders and the allowing of that free flow of capital is that model has changed. All of a sudden, this amazing Canadian independent energy business with world-class CEOs that know how to build great oil and gas businesses are able to access global sovereign, institutional, and private pools of capital, which they weren't able to access before because they just didn't know who they were. And these pools of capital just never had even heard of the Canadian independent energy space. And so I think that's probably the biggest change.
At Grafton, you're focused on diversity. I'm just wondering, how has that enhanced the business?
It just brings in a different viewpoint. And it accesses a whole set of skills and capabilities in a different group of people. We've done a really good job, I think, in Canada of dealing with conscious gender bias. I think what we have challenges over the next couple of decades is going to be the unconscious gender bias. It's going to be having people follow you, which is what the real goal of leadership, because they want to, because they identify with you, they believe in what you are, what you embody. And that's where unconscious gender bias comes into play. And that makes, I think, leadership roles for women very, very difficult. And that'll take more time.
So what needs to be done to attract more women leaders into the C-suite?
I think you have to almost mandate bringing qualified candidates to the table. Boards and leadership often can be a popularity contest just as much as they are a capability and qualification contest. And so if you can set up and make sure that there's enough qualified people at the table that represent a variety of diverse initiatives, whether it's gender, color, sexual orientation, et cetera, then you start to change that conversation. People start to see, wow, they're just as qualified as their male counterpart, and that starts changing. I think, things like comply or explain, although I understand why it's important, as a woman who came up without it, in some ways it invalidates me and my experience and my accomplishments. But I'm supportive of making sure that there is enough representation at that level. So even though it may not be what I'd like to see, I think for that next generation it is important.
Don't be surprised if more female faces start cropping up in Canadian C-suites. The Trudeau government has made diversity a key plank of its innovation agenda. Coming up, how businesses can navigate political risks as they bring their goods to the global stage. So I'm interested to take a look at the global and economic impacts that you guys look at when doing business and making decisions. Given the current political climate that we live in, both domestically and internationally, do you have concerns?
I mean, I think Kirstine said it right earlier that Canada's brand is very strong right now, and I think it's really up to our companies to capitalize on that and really brand themselves Canada. I think exporting Canada, I think, is maybe a theme that we should be thinking about.
Yeah, I completely agree. I will say, you asked if we had any concerns, and I will say what's interesting you've seen recently, right, with what's happened in the European Union, what's happened in the U.S. I think there's a lot more government changes that you're going to see around the world, and the impact it has on everyone in a borderless way. I mean, the Canadians making plans for vacations, for their university or their education, and waiting for these decisions to happen.
In a world where technology, like at a time and space where technology is really pushed for borderless economies, suddenly you have nations with nationalistic tendencies, governments getting in and ruling, and I think trying to close borders. Is it going to be too late for them to close the border? Like, what is their appetite going to be when a Canadian comes knocking on the door? Are they going to say, we only deal with our kind? Like, it's you can sense the movement, and it's quite strong for nationalistic policies, and it's going to be interesting as they try to kind of close ranks a bit.
I think most things are global, and I think it's hard to pull it back. I think there's some mega trends going on in the world which probably won't change. Where you look at because we have globalization, you have the divide between the very wealthy and the poor, both in individuals in society and countries, is a real issue. And I think that you're going to see more governments getting elected to say, look, we don't have to repay our debts. You see it happening in Europe. You're going to see it in other areas. So I think we can't change that. You just got to be aware of it. And you need to be planning for that. So when you're making decisions on where you're going to make things, where you're going to trade, where there's opportunities, where there's risks, you just have to be much more cautious, because governments and borders and trade may change in the future.
I think it does cut both ways. I think taking into consideration all these different inputs, I'm sure over the long history at Magna, you've seen ebbs and flows of some governments really want to encourage expansion in manufacturing operations, and other governments trend away from it. And so the ebbs and flows of it, I think you have to keep an eye on, and actually try to project as best as you can, try to project what the landscape's going to be like in 3 or 5 or 7 years. Because if you're entering a new market and you're looking at what the reality is today, that's not really going to matter. You're talking about a 5 or 10 or 15 year long-term investment. You need to know what it's going to be like.
And you don't know who's going to be in power. You look at places like Argentina and Brazil are terrible places to do business in. What happened in Russia. India's been a very challenging environment for different reasons, but I think things don't change overnight, but they can change over a 5 or 10 year period. I'll be amazed if there's a major change in NAFTA. There might be tweaks, but we're a very small part of the population of the world. So if we say we can't really work together as the 3 countries, that would be very detrimental to all 3 countries.
I think it's a matter of trying to figure out where your business is. Like, ultimately, not all of us have businesses in countries that are necessarily volatile. I think when I look at something like the U.S., the question for me is, with Trump's obsession with bringing back the old America and making America great again, what he sold himself was on a platform of bringing back manufacturing, essentially, and old jobs. Right. So is that an opportunity then for us Canadians who understand that actually the world has changed dramatically? To your point, I'm not sure how much he's going to be able to move business back to that anyway, but he's already been involved personally with things like keeping the carrier plant where it is.
See, that's where we can disagree. I actually don't think making things is old jobs. I agree there's a lot of high-tech jobs coming, but I think for the majority of people you need, rather than just taking raw materials and selling raw materials, if we're smart and we have a policy, we should be figuring out the best and smartest way with the latest technologies to make something and sell to the rest of the world.
He's talking about going back to coal, and I think it's that's what I mean. He's not talking. He's literally talking.
Going down into the coal mines and actually digging out coal.
Because those are the people. He's appealing to an audience that feels disenfranchised because their jobs are gone. To your point, manufacturing today looks much different than it did back then.
And there's many. You look at China; they're very smart. They have a very strong industrial policy, and Korea has had one in the past. They will systematically take all the jobs out of here if we're not smart about figuring out how to compete. We have to be good to compete, but also make sure the trade and currencies and a lot of other things are balanced.
That's one of the things that I think is one of the biggest risks we have, is that we're competing, we're sort of subscale, right? We're a tiny part of the world's population, but then we also don't, you'd think we would, by definition, move faster and be more nimble, and we would be capitalizing on opportunities. I feel like we're subscale in terms of population, but we also often move slowly. We often don't capitalize on opportunities. I don't know if that's a cultural thing in Canada, but to me, I think it's one of the things that holds us back the most.
And a little bit of risk aversion too, right?
Risk aversion, all those things
adding to
yeah.
that, yeah.
So what can you do to become more nimble then, from a business perspective?
Well, we have to, because I mean, in the China example, I mean, they are scale the biggest, and they're moving really quickly where they want to. So I don't know if I mean, we're not going to move to centralized planning, I don't think, anytime soon in Canada. So I think policies that let our government move quickly, I think, are really important.
And so what about opportunities given the political climate? Are there certain countries that now look a little bit more appealing to do business and enter into those markets from your perspective?
I think a fair trade deal between Europe and North America would be very good, because we're both relatively the same in technology, relatively the same in wages, relatively the same in population. So that would be a good deal to do, in my opinion, because it opens up a big part of the market. And as long as it's a fair level playing field, may the best person win. And I think Canadians are very capable of competing and winning.
Up next, we'll hear from a famous Canadian developer drawing inspiration from around the world in pursuit of the perfect property for the new economy. Property developer Ian Gillespie is famous for an aesthetic that ignores borders and pushes boundaries. His team at Westbank is famous for the Pacific Rim Hotel in Vancouver and the Shangri-La in Toronto, both of which draw upon styles outside of the Canadian experience. Gillespie says high-end properties are about much more than just bricks and mortar.
So I really want people, as they go through our buildings, whether it's the hotel like we're sitting in now or our condominium projects, is that they discover them, and that it doesn't just present itself the first time you look at it, but it presents itself continually, and that as you discover it, it unveils itself over time, and that you're continually enriched by that experience. I'm really not that interested in business. I'm interested in making a difference. And I think if you think of these buildings as a physical embodiment of culture, really, that's what they are.
So how have you developed over time? I mean, you started in the early 90s. What's changed in the way that you approach your business or that you approach each project?
I would say we've been pleasantly surprised by how strong the market has been. Now, part of that, to be frank, has been the Canadian dollar. So we have many more American visitors than we might have thought. So that's been good for us. For example, at the Pacific Rim in Vancouver, we would be the first hotel in Canada, first large hotel in Canada to achieve a $500 average rate. And I think that that's significant from the sense that people are willing to value what it is that you're doing.
Clearly then, there is that appetite for this high-end service from a hotel perspective and from a residency perspective. Yeah. Some experts say, the housing market is overheated. Sure. What's your opinion?
Well, those experts have been saying that now for, I'm not sure, 5 or 6 years, and they'll just keep saying it, I guess, until they get it right. But I think that we're all looking at things the wrong way. I think we're looking at things like a moment in time. And rather, we should be looking at this as a continuum. And the truth is that both Toronto and Vancouver would fall in any smart person's judgment of what are the most important cities in the world today. And important in the sense of doing good work, of having investment in infrastructure, of having multicultural demographic, of being younger, of having the educational institutions. Vancouver and Toronto would be in anyone's list of the top 20 cities in the world. By those measures, I think Vancouver and Toronto will continue to do really well. And yes, we'll go through moments. The markets never go straight up. But if I was to look at the next 10, 20 years, do I think Vancouver and Toronto will turn out to be a good investment? 100%.
Well, I mean, if you look at the trend line, the last 5 years, I think it was up about 10% from an appreciation perspective.
Right.
5 years prior to that, it was around 5%. So
Right.
it has doubled.
Right.
So do you think it's just going to continue, or are we going to see a normalization?
I think in Vancouver we probably have started to see a bit of a normalization. But again, when we sell someone an apartment and they're coming in from Tokyo, we don't try to sell them on the basis of buy this place today and a year after you close on it, you should flip it. We think if you've picked the right city to invest in, if you've picked the right building in the right city to invest in the right location in the right city to invest in, and if you have patient money, you will do really well. And the buyers that have bought from us over the decades have proven that thousands of times.
What are you going to bring to, say, the Honest Ed site, which you're currently in development?
Right. The public art project that we're doing there is a conversation that we've now started with the City of Toronto. It's not going to be like anything that has ever been attempted, certainly that I'm aware of. And you're going to have to wait and see. I can't tell you yet.
So what about some of the offerings? Affordable housing, luxury condominiums? Do we know what's going to be on offer in the village?
Yeah. So on that project, we have, I think it's about 22 or 23 heritage buildings that'll be restored on site. So that gives us a natural place to start from. And then it's bringing a fine-grained nature to the new buildings that envelop that heritage. And then it's bringing a public market, because I think Toronto does have this history of these public markets. Walking into a public market that takes on some of our love of live music, that's open in hours that you're not expecting a public market to be open, and is curated in a way that maybe is closer to the Borough Street Market in London, maybe. It's going to have some incredibly interesting retail. We're going to have areas that is really dedicated to pop-up retail. On the residential front, we really want it to be a very diverse neighborhood. I want the new professor at University of Toronto to be there. I want the student at University of Toronto to be there. A well-known Toronto figure approached me the last time I was here and said, I live in the neighborhood. I would love to be able to sell my house and move into your project. Is it right for me? And I said, I've got this many buildings. One of them is going to be exactly what is right for you.
So you could almost customize it to their personality.
In fact, for her, that house will be customized. And that isn't because I'm selling it to her. She's actually going to rent it.
Oh, wow.
And it will still be customized for her. Getting into that level of customization. Yeah.
You're working on affordable housing for low-income earners. Why is that important to you?
I think rental housing is important from a number of different perspectives, and I think that's one of the things that's really great about the Trudeau government is that for the first time since the mid-1970s, we're going to see meaningful investment in public housing. And CMHC is going to take a real active role, I think, and so I think that's something to be really watching for and excited about. And so we're wanting to work with them in partnership with them and the City of Toronto and do some things on affordable housing that maybe haven't been done before. And it's important from a number of perspectives. It's important for our economy as well. One of the advantages of rental housing is that it creates a more vibrant workforce. As our economy has evolved, the idea that you find a job and you work there for 35 years and you retire and those days are gone. And so we need a workforce that's able to respond to the changing environment. And I think that's where rental housing is really important.
And looking forward, which markets would you like to enter into domestically and internationally?
So for us, it's Vancouver, Toronto, Seattle are kind of the three legs on the stool. And now we're expanding into Tokyo. And so now it's going to become a chair and we'll have these four legs. And then from there, I think probably San Francisco will be next. But within Vancouver, Toronto, and Seattle, we're going to go very, very deep. And Tokyo, I think, is going to be really surprising to people what we're able to do there.
We'll keep our eyes peeled for that global expansion from the Westbank team. Coming up, we'll dig into the ways businesses can brace for the technological change reshaping the global economy. Technology now has made it ever easier to do business globally, no matter what industry you're in. So I'm interested to find out what exactly are the changes that you're expecting to occur within your own industries that are going to basically change the way you do business?
Well, I'm really excited about the evolution of the telecommunications industry on that point, Michael. I think 5G networks are coming, and that's going to mean incredible availability of bandwidth for all applications. And I think that one way that Canada can be more globally competitive is getting 5G networks out there ahead of the rest of the world. When you think of autonomous vehicles, and more generally any Internet of Things or any connected vehicle or connected home, all of those things are going to rely on 5G networks to become ubiquitous. And so I think we have an opportunity, given we do have 3 very well-run wireless carriers. They're really well positioned to accelerate the rollout, and that'll mean great advances in all industries.
I'm excited too for financial services and what we see from a technology perspective. Typically an industry that's sort of lagged from a client experience perspective and from a technology perspective. There are so many opportunities now to help people with their finances, to make things simple and easy and help them with their lives. So it's very, very exciting. You combine that with the strength and the stability of the banks that are here. And you look at things like, like Mars, for example, which facilitates innovation in the financial technology space, and even Ryerson, right, who really facilitates young startups who are thinking about financial technology, which make things really easy and I think will really, really help Canadians. And I think it's all very exportable.
So Mars is like an incubator in Toronto in Canada, and then you have Ryerson, the university. But what are some of the risks? Because technology is advancing so quickly, and there's sometimes problems to keep up with it, especially if you're a business that's been doing business for such a long time.
When I look at technology, I would start by looking at what are the new things that are happening in the world. Artificial intelligence, augmented reality, healthcare, in our industry, advanced robotics, 3D printing, nanomaterials. You can do virtual development, you can do virtual testing to try and bring products to market quicker. You can be doing things in all time zones around the world and handoff design. So a lot of things happening in the manufacturing. There's all sorts of implications. There's Industry 4.0 and the connectivity. I'm still trying to figure out where the real advantage is in that, but that's going to change things. So you definitely need to have people that are aware of what's happening in the world in technology, how it applies to your industry, how you can apply it within your own operations. And to attracting and keeping those people is a real challenge, and it's real opportunity.
We see a lot of headlines around autonomous vehicles. How prepared are you, or how prepared is the not only the industry, but the general public? Because it depends on which news organization you read, or there's so many different developments every day when it comes to autonomous vehicles.
So I think the penetration of new technologies and the application of the technology is very quick. To come and do full electric vehicles or full autonomous driving vehicles, there is so many challenges. Magna is at the forefront of a lot of this. We're one of the biggest in the world in autonomous driving technology. Very exciting, a lot of challenges. So you got to take everything with a bit of a grain of salt. And if you talk to people who live in Silicon Valley or live in one of these places, they think the world is going to change because that's what they see every day. The world is not Silicon Valley, and there's a lot of regulations, but there's exciting opportunities almost anywhere you look.
Well, we've seen, from a technology perspective, even just the advances in social media and how that's impacted something as simple as the way businesses communicate, not only with their employees, but with their customers. Are we going to see even more advancements in that space?
Well, I think when you talk about AI and some of the developments there, there is a lot of learning to be had. I know social is just now surpassing search in terms of, value. And I think the one thing that's interesting that's very similar to the world you're talking about is that when you're dealing on a global scale, even within countries itself, not everyone has access to the same technology or the same way to reach. We have to remember that we have to scale our businesses to understand that not everyone has that. And it's like back in the TV days when I remember when bottom thirds came out and HDTVs. Well, it took a long time for people's behaviors to change, where they would go out and buy the new furniture that would accommodate the new kind of television. And we forget sometimes that technology, when you want to be on the forefront, you invest in it, you make sure that you're their first mover, but the world doesn't necessarily move fast along with it, and if you want them to come up to your level, sometimes you have to enable that.
What about the labor market? How do you see the labor market changing as technology evolves?
Well, I think it's already changing significantly, and I think it's going to change an awful lot. I mean, you alluded to robotics, and we look at artificial intelligence, and I think there's a fear. That jobs are going to go away. But I think the opportunity is there's going to be a whole slew of jobs that we don't even know exist today, in terms of programming, robotics, and all those types of things. So getting our heads around that and the education system and those types of things, I think is a real challenge. I mean, 20 years ago, we were not hiring agile scrum masters. We weren't talking about software engineers in quite the same way. And now all industries are competing for these resources. So I think it's an exciting opportunity for young people today, but also a challenge, because I think we're all competing for the same kind of resources, and we're all in different businesses.
How much should we be, say, putting into research and development? What kind of budgets should we be looking at when it comes to research and development?
Well, I think bigger than they are today. So I think we're percentage-wise anyway lagging the OECD from a Canadian perspective, lagging the OECD materially in investment in R&D, and we really need to close that gap very quickly. So I think there are some companies that are leading the way, Magna being one of them, and investing heavily in R&D. But we have a lot of Canadian companies that have been established for a long time, state market share, that often protected by different sorts of regulations that don't actually allow foreign competition to come in against them, so they don't have the same incentives to be investing and innovating. I think we got to turn the tide on that and somehow incentivize our big corporations to be over-investing in R&D in the coming years.
Okay, so taking a step back and taking all of that into consideration, does Canada have the ability to become a leader on the global scale?
We are small, so we need to pick our spots, I think. Where are the 3 or 4 or 5 areas in the world that we can really, automotive being one of them, petroleum, oil and gas products, we could really become a leader in that if we take advantage of new technologies, cleaner technologies, export more of those. We have an opportunity to take a leadership position in what are already important pillars of the economy.
And I think the governments need to understand that they are here to serve industry, and they need to keep their costs down. We just need to control our costs so that we probably spend an hour on that, and I think they kind of recognize it. But you cannot tax your way to success. You'll drive companies out. Whether energy policy and regulations and the list goes on, and overhead, the government's really overhead. They got to be efficient and reduce their costs, and then we can become competitive as a nation.
We have all the capacity in the world. It's, do we have the guts? And do we want to grab the glory? I think I've worked in the States. I always said if we could just bring back 10% of that, grab the brass ring feeling and put it together with the great kind of resilience and smarts and all those things that Canadians have naturally, then I think we'd be the great combination. It's always that thing that people don't like to talk about, but I think we have to recognize that culturally we are not necessarily a country that feels comfortable aiming for it.
We have to just decide we're going to be number 1. Instead of being number 2 or number 3 or number 4 is okay. That's the Canadian way. We need to be number 1.
That's all the time we have for this edition of Bloomberg Sightlines. Thank you so much for joining us. See you next time.
If we're going to do trade deals, we should do intelligent trade deals.
Canada trades like the emerging markets. That is the truth.
If you have patient money, you will do really well.